Today's lesson will look at Pierre Trudeau and his impact on Canadian politics, society, and culture. And in particular, we'll look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and its relationship to the concept of Canadian identity. And in this lesson, we'll be trying to answer the following questions. Who was Pierre Trudeau? What were some of Trudeau's most significant policy accomplishments? And what were some controversies surrounding Trudeau? So who was Pierre Trudeau? He was born October 18th, 1919, and died September 28th, 2000. He was born in Montreal, Quebec, and he was bilingual. And some have suggested that his name, even Pierre Elliot, a French name and an English name put together, that this is his family's way of showing that they were of both worlds. They had one foot in the French world and one foot in the English world, which, again, in Quebec life is very important of sort of bridging the gap between those two. And he was Prime Minister from 1968 till 1979, and then had a second term in office from 1980 till 1984. He was a Liberal Prime Minister. He was married at the age of 51 to a 21-year-old woman. He had 3 kids and was later divorced. And his oldest son, Justin, was elected Prime Minister in 2015. Now, one interesting thing about Trudeau is that he can be seen as a Prime Minister as part of a generational shift. So he succeeded Lester Pearson as Prime Minister. Now, Pearson was a veteran of World War I, and then you go to Trudeau, who was a man who chose not to serve in World War II. So we see we're going from one generation to another, and perhaps how we could see a change in Canadian values that go along with that generational shift. And sort of this generational clash was something that was happening at the time in Canada. So Trudeau sort of played on this in many ways. And he was seen as hip by the media. Again, he reflected the times in many ways with his flamboyant outfits that sort of embraced the fashion of the time. You can see in some of these pictures here, maybe not dressing the way that you might imagine a prime minister dressing. He also famously mocked the Queen by doing a pirouette behind her back at an official meeting. Trudeau and Queen Elizabeth had sort of an interesting relationship that developed over time. Trudeau was not as reverent of the monarchy as previous prime ministers had been. And a lot of Trudeau's political success is often categorized by this idea of Trudeaumania, which is a play on the term Beatlemania. So the Beatles were a popular music act in the 1960s, and sort of this is likening his emergence on the political scene in the late 60s to what happened with the Beatles in the early 60s and taking over pop culture. So Trudeau had a lot of popular support, especially in the 60s when he first became prime minister. And many young people identified with Trudeau. They saw him as a young, energetic, non-conformist prime minister. He was different than other prime ministers. Again, following the footsteps of Pearson, who was this sort of mild-mannered diplomat, we go to Trudeau, who's very flamboyant and in-your-face. Many young people identified with that. And some in the media categorized him as being like a millionaire playboy. He would date celebrities, again, dressing fancy, going to fancy parties. So he had this image that he played up in the popular consciousness. Now, beyond embodying the look of a liberal thinker, Trudeau's policies continued to carry Canada down the path of progressive policies. Some major accomplishments during his time as Prime Minister include decriminalizing homosexuality between consenting adults. And a very famous Trudeau quote about this was that he once said, "There's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. What's done in private between adults does not concern the criminal code." So before the 60s, it was illegal for 2 adults to even consensually engage in homosexual acts. Again, Trudeau is saying that's not the business of the government. What people do in the privacy of their own homes, that's none of our business. It's not the government's job to impose our morals or our religious beliefs on others. That's for them to decide. That's for their private lives. So we see this shift happening in terms of their policies. Under Trudeau, contraception became legalized. Abortion became legalized and more widely accepted. Lotteries became legalized. There was more gun control under Trudeau. They strengthened breathalyzer laws. And they liberalized divorce laws. Now, perhaps Trudeau's greatest accomplishment was the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, before 1982, Canada did not have control over its constitution. If we wanted to amend the BNA Act, we had to ask the British Parliament to do it for us. What the Charter of Rights and Freedoms did was it was a repatriation of the Canadian Constitution. So we're taking it from Britain and we're making this a Canadian responsibility. So now Canada has the ability to amend its constitution in any way it sees fit. We don't have to ask Britain to do it for us. And again, this is one more step away from Britain that we've been seeing over the previous 100 or so years. Starting with Confederation in 1867, Canada comes together as a legal entity and has control over its internal affairs. Then in 1931, we have the Statute of Westminster, and Canada gains control over its external affairs. And now here in 1982, Canada has the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and has the ability to control its own constitution. And again, we can see this as maybe one final step towards Canada gaining full independence. Although, even today we still have in Canada the Queen is the official head of state. Maybe this is this one last piece of that British heritage hanging on, and who knows if that's going to last for the foreseeable future. But we still have the Queen as the head of state now. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, though, again, it's that one last piece of the legal system that's being brought back to Canada. Now, although historians generally consider Trudeau to be one of Canada's most accomplished prime ministers, he was not without his controversies. For one, he enacted the War Measures Act in response to the October crisis of 1970. So this is a crisis that happened in Quebec. There were terrorists who were kidnapping people. They were setting off bombs in response to the treatment of French people in Quebec. They wanted more rights for Quebec people. They wanted perhaps independence for Quebec. So this is a major crisis that's going on. Remember, Trudeau is from Quebec, and he's from this household, which is sort of trying to bridge this gap between the English world and the French world. And this is one of the first tests that Trudeau has as prime minister. And his response to it is very controversial. So the War Measures Act, if you remembered, had only been enacted 2 times before. Once during World War I and during World War II. And what the War Measures Act does is it allows the government to suspend the rights of Canadians. So the government can, they can arrest people without a warrant. They can search people's property without a warrant. They can hold people for an indefinite amount of time when they arrest them. So this gives the government quite a lot of power. And so, this is sort of the irony of the prime minister who eventually gave Canada its Charter of Rights and Freedoms, taking away civil liberties during this crisis. Was not lost on many people. And when asked how far he would go in stopping the terrorists, there's a very famous interview that he gave to the CBC at the time, and his response to the reporter was, "Just watch me." His national energy program was also unpopular in Western Canada, so he is remembered far less fondly in the Western provinces than in the rest of Canada. And his unpopularity in Western Canada has hurt the Liberal Party's electoral chances for many years. It helped lead to a sense of Western alienation, which in turn led to the rise of the Reform Party in the 1980s, and the Conservative Party's dominance of Western politics, particularly in Alberta, to this day. And so in summary, Pierre Trudeau was Canada's 15th Prime Minister and served from 1968 till 1979, and again from 1980 till 1984. Trudeau was responsible for many progressive policy changes, including legalizing divorce, decriminalizing homosexuality, and creating the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And although Trudeau is generally remembered well by historians and many Canadians, his legacy is more mixed in Quebec and Western Canada.